A study published in 2018 by the University of Pennsylvania suggested that they had finally proven a link between social media use and depression. Now, this is something that we've suspected for a long time, but it was nice to finally have these results to back it up. Facebook was bad, Snapchat was bad, Instagram was bad. These were all unhealthy for us. Then, at the start of 2019, Brock University published a study that they had been conducting, one that was conducted over a longer period of time. And this study suggested that actually they couldn't prove that social media led to depression. In fact, they didn't find that social media predicted any depressive symptoms over time for either males or females. However, the one thing they did find is that younger adolescent girls with depressive symptoms did seem to use social media more. And it almost seemed like it was the depressive symptoms that pushed them to social media and not the other way around. So that begs the question, is social media bad for us? Or is it actually okay? That's what we're exploring in this episode of Redlily Radio. Hey guys, I'm your host John Ostman, and today we're going to start with something that happened on a trip to Kyoto about 6 years ago. So a good friend and I were travelling through Japan, and about halfway through we were in the city of Kyoto, which is this beautiful big city. It's actually the old capital of Japan back before Tokyo was. But whereas Tokyo is filled with futuristic buildings and skyscrapers and nightlife, Kyoto's the other side of Japan. It's filled with traditional temples of both Shinto and Zen Buddhism, two of the strong veins in Japan's history. And we happened to be at one particular Zen Buddhist temple on a tour. Now this was a day tour where we were being led around by this little old man. He was kind of sweet, really. He had this cheeky smile that he would pull out from time to time, and I think he was using it fairly strategically just to charm us a bit. So we were walking through this beautiful garden that was framed by this fine layer of snow, as it was the middle of winter there. And we got to the central part of the temple where there was a Zen garden. Now you would have seen one of these Zen gardens on TV or in a movie. So essentially it's this sand pit with several rocks placed throughout it meticulously by the monks that live and work there. So we get to this platform where we're overlooking this Zen garden. And our cheeky little tour guide turns to us and he says, "Okay guys, I have a game for you. I want you to find a spot on this platform for about 3 minutes. Take in the beauty, but I want you to count as many rocks as you can see here. And then when we come back, tell me how many rocks you found." So we did. There was about 8 of us on the tour. We all found our own little spot. And we started counting these rocks. Now, I counted 13. And it seemed fairly simple to me. It was 13. So I thought it was just one of those tour icebreakers. So we reconvened after the end of the 3 minutes and we told him. I started. I was confident. 13 rocks. And then everyone looked at me weirdly. Okay, that's weird. Person next to me said 14 rocks. Oh, that's weird. I didn't think I missed anything. The person next to them, 15 rocks. Okay. Either we're all idiots or there's something strange going on here. And of course our tour guide, this was all part of his master plan, so his little cheeky smile got a bit wider. He turned to us and he revealed the secret to this problem. He said, "You see, in Zen gardens, they're built specifically so you can't see every single rock from a single vantage point. And they use this as a tool for reflection and as a life lesson that from any one perspective, you can never get the full perspective. From any one view, you can never get the full story." Now in the book Flow by the psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, he explains that our nervous system is actually incapable of processing more than 110 bits of information per second. Now, as much as we like to believe that we can see everything, know everything, it really just isn't true. And that can be something quite hard to accept at first, and if you're finding it a little bit of a letdown, don't worry, you're not alone. But what seems like something disappointing, that we only have this sort of narrow scope of view of the world, can actually be something that we leverage. But we'll get back to that. First, we need to touch on the everyday news and the view of the world that it gives us. Now, about 2 years ago, I was traveling through Spain, visiting a few of the cities there. Now, there was one city that we were going to, Barcelona, that we had started hearing about on the news.
So it looks very clear at this very early stage in the voting process that Madrid is not going to let this happen.
Now, we had the very fortunate luck that the exact day that we were going into Barcelona was a day that a good number of separatists had decided to have a vote for independence to try and break away from the rest of Spain. So Madrid, being the capital of Spain, said, no, you can't have this vote. But a great number of people in Barcelona decided to go ahead with it anyway. Madrid sent in the federal police to stop the vote, and a clash between police and civilians ensued. Now, there was some bad police brutality that occurred, and I won't pretend that that wasn't true. But I can tell you my experience. Now, my parents were seeing this on the news and obviously very worried for my safety. And here's the stressful thing. We happened to be staying about 10 minutes walk from where this was all happening, from the city centre. And we were out in one of the parks at the time. And I have to tell you what we saw. We saw people out walking their dogs and throwing frisbees and kind of just enjoying the sunshine. And so where the news had taken these clips of police brutality, which did happen and was a very real thing, they showed it as if this was all of Barcelona, that the whole city was tearing itself apart. And that, quite simply, just was not the full story. In fact, it probably wasn't even most of the story. The news, it doesn't outright lie, but it takes a small slither of the truth, the 1%, and it makes it seem like it's the whole story. The kind of news that sells, the kind of news that people get excited and interested about, this is the negative news. And so what happens is then our news cycle, both on TV and online, ends up being filled with this breaking world news of all these massive tragedies.
From the centre of Madrid, these are the...
And it's no wonder that people feel like the world is in a horrible place. But the actual fact is, our world is not in a horrible place. Yes, there are horrible things happening, but if we look at the whole picture, we see that people these days are living longer than ever, that the global GDP is at its highest in many nations, that extreme poverty is falling, and that more people are getting more education than ever before. Some people would argue that this is actually the best time in history, and it's only getting better. So, if we consider that we can only take in so much information throughout every one day, and that we have this sort of limited perspective, but we do want to be more connected to what's going on in the world, what we shouldn't do is just blindly accept the news that comes on television or that is spread around by the biggest players in the news industry. Now, again, they aren't necessarily lying to us. I'm not saying this is a conspiracy theory, but what I'm saying is what they say is not the whole story. And so we need to be aware of these streams of information that are coming into our limited day-to-day, because this builds our worldview. Think of it like your diet. You can only eat a certain amount of meals per day. And I know some of us like to push that, which is fine, no judgment here. But, you will only eat a certain amount of meals in one day. And so you choose which foods you eat based on a variety of reasons. Now, having snacks and eating yummy food isn't a bad thing. But if that's all we ate, then we would feel like crap. It's the same with the sources of information we let into our life. The sources of news and news feeds. Think of it as our information diet. Because what is key here is, based on our information diet, the information that comes in slowly changes our perspective of our world, of what we believe is real in the world. It changes our worldview. Now, it's not just that it changes our worldview, but what our worldview is actually then changes how we feel about the world, and what we believe is possible in the world. And this changes then how we will react and act. If I had heard that news story about Barcelona before I went there, if I had seen these scenes of police brutality and the way it was described as being all over the city, I probably would have cancelled my plans there. But I'm really glad I didn't, because it was probably my favourite place in all of Spain. So much culture there, so much beauty. The food there is amazing. And so this all comes back to this initial question of, is social media bad for us? I believe it's not bad for us, but it really matters how we use it. We're going to get these news stories coming in through various news organisations, more often than not just shared by our friends, and that's fine. But now knowing that our information diet matters, there's a few things we can do to curate our information streams a bit more, to cultivate our information diet. One technique I like to use is to think of our news sources as scouts. Now, if you think back to the old days, let's say we're back in a village. Now, we would need a way to find information about the world around us, about the environment around us. Now, this is key for survival. And so we would designate certain people to be scouts, and we would send them out into the wilderness to go exploring, see what they could find, and then come back and report this information. Now, by having a variety of scouts, we would actually get a variety of perspectives. And this would not only widen our own perspective, but then we would get multiple layers of perspectives that we could check against each other. This is kind of what we can do with our own news feed or our news streams. We can gradually find news sources that we trust, a more interesting exposure to certain parts of the world, but aren't all about shocking headlines and content that really isn't that deep. And by gradually building up an assortment of these, then we essentially are having our scouts out there in the world that are finding this really interesting information and reporting it back to us. So for example, I personally follow futurism.com, which is a news site about current and future technologies that doesn't have its head in the clouds, but is still fairly optimistic. I also follow another news site called Neuroscience News. Now this is so I can get snapshots into the world of emerging science about the human brain, nervous system, and even sometimes artificial intelligence. The articles on that website are referencing at least one scientific study each, and so that helps bring some of that information into my world. So as you gather more news sources, it can be a little bit tricky to keep track of them all, but luckily the programmers of the world are creating these tools for us all the time. And so I use a news aggregator application called Feedly. Now, I should say this podcast isn't sponsored by any of these businesses or organizations, but these are some examples of tools that I have found quite helpful. So with Feedly, you can plug in all the different news sources you want, and it creates essentially a news feed of all these sources. So you just have to go to one place and see it all. Now, another example is if you are getting sick of your Facebook news feed, but you still use it for events and Messenger and things like that, there's actually plugins you can find for your browser. One is called Newsfeed Eradicator, where it will disable your newsfeed and replace it with a uplifting quote. And so for those times that you go to Facebook and kind of click through it without really knowing what you're doing because it's all become so intuitive, and so then you're met with no newsfeed, but a positive quote, that can help block you out of that autopilot scrolling through Facebook. So to come back to the original question of, is social media unhealthy for us? Well, I believe the answer is no, it's not. Any technology acts as an amplifier, which means if we use it for bad, then it can amplify the effects of that. But if we use it for good and if we learn how to use it wisely, then it can be amazing. It can enrich our lives in all sorts of ways that couldn't be enriched before. And so not just with social media, but with our news, and with any upcoming technology that we find ourselves in the midst of, it's worth taking a little bit of time to think about how we're using it and try to find healthier ways of using it, because it's not necessarily automatically bad for us. And these technologies can actually be a life-enriching tool.